The apartment wasn't anything special. Tiny kitchen, creaky floors, and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. But it was mine. A fresh start. The building had that old charm I liked, with its narrow hallways and vintage tile work. The courtyard view wasn't much, just a rectangle of cracked concrete framed by identical windows from the neighboring building across the way. It didn't take long for me to notice him. My neighbor across the courtyard, 3rd floor, 2 windows to the left. An older man, maybe in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and sunken cheeks. He was always at his window staring, not just out at the courtyard, but directly into my living room. First, I shrugged it off. People in these old buildings didn't have much to do, and maybe he was just lonely. But the way he stood there, perfectly still, his face pale and emotionless, it felt wrong. First, I tried to ignore it. I'd close the curtains when I noticed him, avoid lingering near the window, and tell myself it was just an old man with too much time on his hands. But then the notes started. The first one appeared one evening, slipped under my door. It was written in jagged, uneven handwriting on a scrap of yellowed paper. "You shouldn't leave your curtains open at night." I stared at it for a long time, the words digging into me like splinters. My first instinct was to blame the neighbor across the courtyard. But when I looked out my window, his light was off, and the room behind the glass was dark and lifeless. The second note arrived 2 days later. "Someone is watching you." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through my curtains, I heard it. A faint tap, tap, tap against my living room window. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape. Slowly, I crept into the living room, my heart pounding with every step. The window was closed and locked, the glass reflecting only my pale face and wide eyes. But then I saw it. Something faint, almost invisible in the corner of the window. A single smudge, a fingerprint. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe. But the smudge on the window lingered in my mind, an undeniable reminder that something wasn't right. I pulled the curtains shut and spent the day in a haze, jumping at every small noise. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, I glanced across the courtyard out of habit. The neighbor's window was dark, the curtains drawn back just enough for me to see the empty room beyond. But something about it felt off. The window was slightly open, just an inch, like someone had left it ajar in a hurry. I told myself not to obsess over it, but that night the tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, almost gentle, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. I stayed frozen on my couch, clutching a blanket tightly around me, staring at the window with wide eyes. Then, from across the courtyard, I saw it. A faint flicker of movement in the neighbor's darkened apartment. A shift of a shadow, like someone stepping just out of sight. My stomach turned to ice. The man was supposed to be missing. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I went down to the building manager's office, clutching the 2 anonymous notes in my hand. "Apartment 3C, I said, my voice trembling. "The neighbor across from me. Do you know, has anyone checked on him recently?" The building manager frowned and adjusted his glasses. 3C? That apartment's been empty for weeks, miss. The tenant went missing about a month ago. Police came by, did their checks, but no sign of him. Why? I felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. But the window, it's open, and I've seen someone in there. His expression darkened. That's impossible. But I could tell by the way he avoided my eyes that he wasn't entirely convinced himself. That night, I couldn't stop staring at the darkened window across the courtyard. The inch-wide gap, the faint curtains swaying in the breeze. It felt like a wound, something festering and unseen. I was about to turn away when I saw it. A face, just barely visible in the shadows, pressed close to the glass. Pale skin, hollow eyes, and a mouth slightly open, as if mid-breath. And then, slowly, it tilted its head to the side, as if it knew I was watching. I stumbled back from the window, my knees hitting the edge of the coffee table. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as I clutched the curtain, pulling it shut with trembling hands. The image of that face, the pale skin, the hollow eyes, the way it tilted its head, was burned into my mind. I spent the next hour pacing my apartment, clutching my phone, debating whether or not to call the police. What would I even say? There's someone staring at me from an apartment where no one's supposed to be? I could already hear the dispatcher's skeptical voice in my head. But then came the sound that made the decision for me. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time, more insistent. I froze mid-step, staring at the window from across the room. And then my phone buzzed. It was a text message. "Why did you close the curtains?" My stomach dropped. The number was unknown. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I typed back, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "Come see me." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my keys and bolted out of my apartment. My mind screamed at me to get out, to get away. But instead of leaving the building entirely, my feet carried me up the stairwell, toward apartment 3C. The door was slightly ajar when I arrived, the faint smell of mildew and something metallic wafting out into the hallway. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone in there?" No answer. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The apartment was dark, the air thick with a suffocating stillness. The window, the same one I'd been staring at for days, was wide open now, curtains fluttering weakly in the night breeze. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the figure, the man. His head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, his hollow eyes fixed on me. But something was wrong. His skin was grayish, stretched tight over his skull, and his mouth hung slightly open, frozen in a silent expression of something. Fear? Pain? And then I realized he wasn't standing. He was hanging. A length of frayed rope disappeared into the shadows above, tied around his neck. His feet dangled just an inch above the floor. But the worst part? His head twitched, just slightly. His eyes moved. They locked onto mine, and his mouth twitched as if he was trying to form words. I stumbled back. A scream caught in my throat, and that's when I noticed it. The tapping sound wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the wall. I turned my head slowly, following the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was right behind me. I bolted out of the apartment, nearly tripping over my own feet as I crashed down the stairwell and back into my own unit. I slammed the door, locked it, and shoved the couch against it for good measure. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went straight to the building manager. I told him everything, the tapping, the notes, the man in the window. He didn't say much, just nodded and promised he'd look into it. Later that day, I saw police cars parked outside the building. 2 officers carried out a body bag from apartment 3C. I moved out a week later. The official report said the man in apartment 3C had been dead for weeks before I even moved in. They ruled it a suicide. But there was one detail they couldn't explain. His body had been discovered lying flat on the floor, not hanging, and his window, it was still open. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in my new apartment, far from that building, I still hear it faintly in my head. Tap, tap, tap. And I wonder if someone or something is still waiting for me to open the curtains. The house wasn't anything special, but it was exactly what we needed. A fresh start. After Mom passed, Dad wanted somewhere quieter, away from the constant reminders of her absence. The rental house had creaky floors, outdated wallpaper, and a sprawling backyard that stretched into a line of trees. At the far edge of the yard, half hidden by overgrown weeds, stood an old shed. Its paint was peeling, and the wooden door was secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. "Don't bother with the shed," the landlord had said during our walkthrough. He was a wiry man with tired eyes and nicotine-stained fingers. "Just junk in there. Old tools, broken furniture, nothing worth your time." Dad nodded, barely paying attention, but I couldn't stop staring at the shed. Something about it felt off. The tiny window near the top was so dirty it was almost opaque, but it gave me the distinct feeling that someone or something was looking back at me. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful. Dad buried himself in fixing minor things around the place, and I spent most of my time in my room, headphones on, pretending everything was normal. But every time I stepped into the backyard, my eyes were drawn to that shed. The padlock glinted faintly in the sunlight, like it was daring me to come closer. Night, it was worse. From my bedroom window, I had a clear view of the backyard, and the shed sat at the edge of the darkness like a gaping mouth. It was hard to tell in the faint moonlight, but I started noticing shadows. Quick movements like someone darting past the dirty window. And then there was the sound. Faint, metallic clinking, like chains being dragged across the floor or tools being shifted. I told Dad about it one night over dinner. He brushed it off, saying it was probably just animals, raccoons or stray cats. But animals don't make shadows that look human, and they definitely don't move with deliberate slowness like I'd seen. One Friday night, Dad fell asleep early on the couch, and I stayed up playing video games. Around midnight, I heard it again. Clink, clink, clink. It wasn't faint this time. It was louder, like it was coming from just beyond the shed door. I stood by the window, squinting into the darkness. The padlock hung loosely from the latch, swinging slightly in the breeze. And the door, it was open. Just an inch, but enough to show a sliver of pitch black inside. My stomach tightened, and a cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck. I crept downstairs, woke Dad up, and told him what I'd seen. He groaned, rubbing his eyes, but grabbed a flashlight and slipped on his shoes. "Stay here," he said firmly before heading into the backyard. I watched from the window as he walked across the yard, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He stopped in front of the shed, hesitated for just a second, then pulled the door open wider and stepped inside. From my spot at the window, I could see the beam of Dad's flashlight darting around inside the shed. His silhouette was framed by the faint glow, casting distorted shadows against the decaying wooden walls. The door creaked as it swung slightly in the breeze, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then Dad froze. I could tell by the way his shoulders tensed and his head turned slowly toward something deeper in the shed. The light wobbled slightly as if his hand was trembling. I pressed my forehead against the glass, straining to see what he was looking at. Suddenly, he stumbled back, nearly tripping over something on the floor. His flashlight clattered to the ground, rolling and casting a chaotic beam of light across the shed walls. He turned and practically ran out of the shed, slamming the door behind him and pulling the padlock shut with shaking hands. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his head bowed. Then he looked back toward the house and saw me watching him. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. When he came inside, he didn't say anything at first. He just locked the back door and closed the curtains tightly. I followed him into the kitchen, where he poured himself a glass of water, his hands still trembling slightly. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head slowly. "Nothing. There's nothing in there. Just junk." But he was lying. I knew he was lying. Later that night, when the house was silent again and Dad had gone to bed, I crept back downstairs. His flashlight was still sitting on the kitchen counter, and next to it was a small object I hadn't noticed before. A shoe. A child's shoe. It was small, scuffed, and stained with something dark near the sole. My stomach churned, and I felt like I might be sick. The shed door was locked again, but that didn't change the way it felt. Like whatever was in there wasn't done with us yet. The shoe sat on the counter like an accusation, its dark stain catching the faint kitchen light. I couldn't stop staring at it. My mind raced with questions. Whose shoe was it? How long had it been there? And why was Dad pretending everything was fine? Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak of the old house felt like footsteps. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like a whisper. I could hear Dad pacing in his room above me, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as if he was trying not to wake me. But I was already awake. The next morning, Dad avoided eye contact. He made breakfast silently, his movements stiff and mechanical. When I finally worked up the courage to ask about the shoe, he snapped. "It's nothing. Just drop it." "Okay," he barked, slamming a plate down on the counter hard enough to make me flinch. But that night, the tapping started again. I was in my room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, trying to distract myself from the unease that clung to me like a second skin. Then I heard it. Faint, metallic tapping coming from the backyard. Clink, clink, clink. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. The shed stood at the far end of the yard, barely illuminated by the moonlight. The padlock was swinging gently, tapping against the wooden door. But what froze me in place wasn't the padlock. It was the window, a face, small, pale, and hollow-eyed, pressed against the dirty glass. A child's face. I stumbled back from the window, my breath caught in my throat. My hand flew to my mouth to keep from screaming. I could still see the faint outline of the face burned into my vision. The way it didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. I ran to Dad's room, throwing the door open. "Dad, someone's in the shed." He was sitting on the edge of his bed, clutching the shoe in his hands. His knuckles were white, and his eyes were red-rimmed, staring down at the worn leather as if it held all the answers. "Dad," I whispered. He looked up at me, his face hollow and broken. "I should have never opened it," he said softly. Dad's words hung heavy in the air. "I should have never opened it." His voice was hollow, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. The shoe in his trembling hands looked impossibly small, fragile, like it didn't belong in this world anymore. "What do you mean, Dad?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He rubbed his face with one hand, the other still clutching the shoe. "When I went in there was something wrong. The smell, the air, it felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. And I thought I heard something, a faint voice, like a child, crying." My stomach turned. "Did you see anyone?" Dad shook his head slowly. "No one. Just that shoe in the corner and..." He stopped, his voice cracking slightly. "And scratch marks on the inside of the door, like someone had been trying to claw their way out." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Then we have to call someone. The police, someone." "No." Dad's voice was sharp, almost desperate. "No one goes back in there. Whatever's in that shed, it doesn't want to be found. And I think it doesn't want us here either." That night, neither of us slept. Dad stayed in the living room, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, staring out the glass patio doors into the backyard. I stayed in my room, lights on, eyes fixed on the shed through my window. The tapping started again around midnight. Clink, clink, clink. But this time, there was something else. A faint sound carried on the night air. A child's voice. "Let me out." The words were soft, fragile, like they were being whispered from somewhere deep underground. I pulled the curtains shut, my chest heaving with panicked breaths. Then came the sound of the padlock hitting the ground. Clang. I bolted downstairs to find Dad already halfway across the backyard, flashlight in hand. "Dad!" I shouted, chasing after him. He didn't stop. The shed door was wide open now, swinging gently in the breeze. The air around it felt colder, heavier, almost suffocating. "Stay back," Dad ordered, stepping into the shed. I froze at the doorway, the smell of rot and mildew hitting me like a wall. Inside, Dad's flashlight beam scanned the space. Empty shelves, a rusted wheelbarrow, and the same child's shoe lying abandoned in the corner. But then the beam caught something else, something carved into the wooden floor. "Help me." Dad took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. And then, from somewhere deep in the shadows of the shed, came a sound that still haunts me to this day. A soft giggle, high-pitched, childlike, but wrong. The door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the night. The police came after we called them, after we spent nearly an hour outside, too afraid to go back in. They found nothing inside the shed but dust, decay, and those faint carvings on the floor. The landlord was furious when he heard we'd opened it. "I told you not to mess with that shed," he barked over the phone. But when Dad asked him directly, What happened there? The line went silent. Eventually, the landlord muttered something about bad history and things better left alone. We moved out a week later. Dad didn't say much during the packing, and I didn't ask. But sometimes, late at night in our new home, I still hear it faintly in my head. Clink, clink, clink. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see it. The faint outline of a child's face, staring out from a dirty window, mouth curled into a smile that doesn't reach its hollow eyes. Renting the storage locker felt like a practical solution at first. Our new apartment was cozy, real estate speak for tiny, and we couldn't bring ourselves to part with things we thought we might need someday. The facility wasn't anything special. Rows of identical metal roll-up doors, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the faint scent of mildew hanging in the still air. It felt impersonal, utilitarian, and most importantly, secure. The first sign that something wasn't right came during a routine visit to grab an old set of dishes. As we walked down the narrow corridor toward Unit 316, I stopped short. Our padlock, the solid, brass one we'd bought specifically for this place, was gone. In its place hung a newer, shinier lock, completely unfamiliar. My boyfriend, Alex, frowned, jiggling it slightly. "Did you change this?" he asked, but we both already knew the answer. We flagged down the facility manager, a middle-aged man named Rick who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. After some back and forth and a lot of shoulder shrugging, Rick cut the unfamiliar lock off with a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. "Probably a mix-up," he said, barely glancing at us as he swung open the metal door. Inside, everything looked normal. Our boxes were still stacked in the corner, labeled with my messy handwriting. The old love seat Alex couldn't bear to part with was right where we'd left it, draped in a dusty sheet. But there was something sharp and chemical in the air, a faint smell of bleach. It clung to the back of my throat, and I caught Alex wrinkling his nose as he noticed it too. "Does this place clean the units?" I asked Rick, trying to sound casual. Rick let out a short laugh. "Lady, we barely vacuum the hallways. No one cleans these units unless someone asks for it specifically." That answer didn't sit right with me, but there wasn't much we could do. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place. Felt like the end of a strange, slightly unsettling story. But then we came back the following week. It was supposed to be a quick visit. Alex wanted to grab his old guitar, and I needed a few winter coats. But when we rolled open the metal door to Unit 316, we both froze. There, in the middle of the concrete floor, was a stain. Large, irregular, and dark brownish red. It spread out in uneven splotches like something had been spilled or dragged. The smell hit us next. Not bleach this time, but something earthy, metallic. Like rust, like blood. "Jesus Christ," Alex muttered, stepping back. "What the hell happened in here?" I couldn't move. Couldn't even breathe. My mind raced, trying to piece together how this could have happened. Did someone break in? Why our unit? And what had caused that stain? Alex pulled out his phone, muttering about calling the manager again. But before he could dial, I spotted something in the corner of the unit, partially hidden behind one of our cardboard boxes. A shoe, not ours. Small, scuffed, with a patch of what looked like dried mud or worse on the sole. Alex noticed the shoe at the same time I did. His face went pale, and he slowly crouched down to take a closer look. He didn't touch it. Neither of us wanted to, but we both recognized the unsettling weight of its presence. It didn't belong here. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to talk to someone now." We practically ran to the front office, the echo of our footsteps bouncing off the cold concrete walls. Rick was there again, sitting behind his desk and sipping a soda. He raised an eyebrow when he saw us. "Another mix-up?" he asked dryly. "No," Alex said firmly, placing his phone on the desk. "There's a stain in our unit. A shoe. And it smells, Rick. Something's not right." Rick's expression shifted slightly, just a flicker of discomfort, before he sighed and pulled up the facility's security footage on his monitor. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. The grainy black and white feed showed someone entering our unit 2 nights ago at around 3 a.m. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a hooded jacket pulled low over their face. They carried something heavy, wrapped in what looked like a tarp. The figure moved deliberately, methodically. They stayed in the unit for almost an hour before slipping back out into the dark hallway. But there was one detail that made my stomach turn. When they turned toward the camera briefly, we could just make out the faint outline of gloves. Rubber gloves. Rick leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "That's not good." "No kidding," I snapped, my voice cracking. "What do we do?" "Who was that?" "We'll call the police," Rick said, his voice low. "But listen, you two should probably stay away from the unit for now. Just let the authorities handle this." The police arrived within the hour. They taped off our storage unit and questioned us separately. They took photos of the stain, the shoe, and the footage Rick had pulled up. But despite all the questions, did you notice anything strange before this? Had you seen anyone suspicious? Was there anything missing? We had no answers. That night, Alex and I sat in silence in our tiny apartment. Neither of us touched our dinner, and every creak in the floorboards made me flinch. The next morning, Alex got a call from one of the officers. They'd finished analyzing the footage and walked through our unit again. Their conclusion was chilling. There was no sign of anything having been removed from the unit. Nothing had been taken, moved, or even touched, except for the shoe and the stain. Whatever happened in that unit, whatever the hooded figure had done, it wasn't about us. But then, why choose our unit? The next few days were a blur of uneasy silences and unanswered questions. The police promised to keep us updated, but every call ended with the same frustrating words. "We're still investigating." Alex and I stopped visiting the storage unit altogether. Neither of us wanted to step foot in that cold, metallic room again. But something didn't sit right with me. I kept replaying the footage in my head. The hooded figure, the deliberate movements, the stain left behind. It felt intentional, like our unit had been chosen. I spent hours scouring local news sites, trying to find any story, any clue about a crime or a missing person that might fit. And then I found it. A small article buried under larger headlines. "Local woman still missing after 2 weeks." The photo showed a young woman, mid-20s, smiling brightly in a selfie. The timeline matched up almost perfectly with the night someone entered our unit. I showed Alex the article, my finger trembling as I pointed at the date. "It's her, Alex. It has to be her. The timeline, the stain, the shoe. It fits." Alex's face paled as he stared at the screen. "But why our unit? Why would they pick ours?" We decided to go back one last time. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I needed closure. I needed to see it for myself. Rick wasn't at the facility that night, but another staff member led us into the hallway leading to Unit 316. The smell of bleach still lingered faintly in the air, clinging to the cold metal walls. The police tape had been removed, and the door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. We stepped inside, the fluorescent lights flickering above us. The stain had faded, now just a faint discoloration on the concrete floor, but the shoe was still there, now sealed in an evidence bag and leaning against one of our boxes. Alex bent down, examining the corner of the unit. "There's something here," he said, his voice tight. I knelt beside him and squinted. Scratches. Tiny, uneven marks along the edge of the floor near the wall, like someone had been trying to claw their way out. And then we heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, faint, coming from somewhere behind the metal wall. We froze, our breath caught in our throats. Alex glanced at me, his eyes wide with panic. There's another unit behind this wall," I whispered. "Someone's in there." The tapping stopped abruptly. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. We didn't stay to find out more. We bolted out of Unit 316, out of the hallway, and out into the cold night air. The next morning, we called the police again. They promised to investigate, to check the unit behind ours. But later that evening, we got another call. "There's nothing there," the officer said. "No sign of anyone. No evidence of forced entry. The unit behind yours is completely empty. I hung up, my hands shaking. Alex sat beside me, staring blankly at the wall. Do you think he started, his voice barely a whisper? Do you think someone's still in there? Like, still in the walls, somehow? I didn't answer. We canceled our rental agreement the next day and moved our belongings into a different facility across town. But even now, sometimes at night, I hear faint sounds in my head. Tap, tap, tap. And I wonder if somewhere, in some dark, narrow space behind the walls of Unit 316, someone or something is still waiting.